Good morning and welcome to the Collaborative on Health and the Environment Alaska teleconference on coal mining in Alaska, hazards to human health and the environment. My name is Diana DeFazio and I'll be facilitating today's call on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. I hear a lot of people just joining, so I might just wait a few more seconds so that they can be on. Okay, Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the websites www.healthandenvironment.org and www.akaction.org. Except for the speakers, all participants are muted during the presentation. There will be time for discussion and questions towards the end of the call. And joining us today are Dr. Michele Prevost to discuss health effects of coal mining, and Jessica Winnestaffer of Chickaloon Village Traditional Council and Dennis Gann of Cook Inletkeeper to talk about community concerns over plans to develop coal mines at Wishbone Hill and Chuitna. There are no formal presentations to follow along with on this call. However, there are background materials, including maps, fact sheets, and a PowerPoint by Dr. Prevost that includes much of what she will be covering today. These can all be found by going to the homepage of our website, www.akaction.org, and clicking on the title of today's call at the left. There was a problem with the link that I sent out on Friday, so please just go to the ACAT homepage to access these materials. Now, I'd like to welcome and introduce our first speaker, Michele Prevost. Dr. Prevost graduated from medical school at Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in 1993. Before training in orthopedic surgery, completed Wilford Hall Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas in 2000. She spent 2 years as a flight surgeon, which is a form of occupational health. After a total of almost 25 years in the U.S. Air Force, Dr. Prevost entered private practice as an orthopedic surgeon in Palmer, Alaska. She became interested in the health impacts of coal after being told that a large open-pit coal mine was going to be developed directly adjacent and upwind to her new neighborhood. And Michele, would you like to begin?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you to everyone taking the time to listen in to us today. As a physician, when we speak, we usually start off by recognizing any conflicts of interest, such as associations with manufacturers and stuff. Well, in this case, my conflict is a personal concern with the future of coal development in the Matanuska Valley. So I'm going to be upfront about that. Those of you may think my discussion is biased because of that. We'll find that I try to stick to the facts. There is occasional opinion thrown in. Most people on the line are going to be very familiar with coal, but we'll start with basics. Coal is a compressed organic matter millions of years ago got compressed deep in the earth, made up of plant and animal materials, but also compressed in the high volumes are some toxic and radioactive metals, and those are the issues of concern. Coal is a recognized toxic substance by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It has its own MSDS as being a toxic substance. There are actually extensive safety and health regulations to protect miners, but there is really nothing protecting the general public. Toxic components of coal and the mining practices, basically, I believe, are common sense. 1 + 1 = 2. Well, mercury, lead, and arsenic are toxic to human health. They're poisons. They are elements of coal. And so if you release those elements into the air and water supply, you're going to poison people. You're going to make people sick. And I think this is fairly logical. Unfortunately, there's not a great deal of science to back up my logic. There is extensive research on the effects of pollution from coal-fired power plants and other pollution, which is known to cause thousands of deaths in the United States annually. But for various political reasons, there's been very little research done on actual effects of coal mining. Some details I'd like to provide about what's in coal you can also find summarized on my talk on the website, but basically probably one of the most concerning toxins of coal is arsenic. Now, arsenic is also present in other areas of our lives. It can be found, it used to be found in medicine, it can be found in farming sometimes, it can actually be found in cosmetics, but there's also can be large amounts of arsenic in coal. And when the arsenic gets released from the coal mining, coal washing, coal processing, coal burning, all those different processes, gets released into the air and water supply, it can result, especially in water, having groundwater, creeks, aquifers surrounding wherever coal is being processed, massively high levels of arsenic. There's one EPA study that shows that some areas adjacent to coal slurry ponds may have arsenic levels that produce a cancer risk of 1 in 100, which is 10,000 times the normal safe amount. Arsenic will start with causing headaches and confusion, sometimes some gastrointestinal symptoms, but later will lead to seizures, coma, and death. It's a poison. It's one of the most potent poisons. There's also mercury. Mercury gets its fame from don't eat tuna. Well, mercury comes about half from the environment, but the other half comes from burning a coal and releasing that in the environment. Certainly, mercury is also going to be found in high concentrations in the water supply surrounding any coal processing facility, whether that be mining, storage, and it's a neurotoxin, and especially during pregnancy, early childhood, it causes nervous system disorders, basically irreversible damages to the nervous system, and in higher concentrations it leads to death. Some other toxic metals in coal that are concerning include lead. Everybody's familiar with lead after the whole lead paint issue. It affects pretty much every organ system. Cadmium, which causes high blood pressure, kidney damage, and is associated probably with prostate cancer. Vanadium causes lung damage and birth defects. Selenium, which is associated with liver failure, fluid in the lungs called pulmonary edema, and eventually death. Also found in coal, besides the heavy metals, are benzene derivatives, complicated long chemical names, but these are well associated to cause cancer. There are radioactive materials, uranium, radium, which becomes radon, are both toxic and radioactive. And then when I get into discussing coal dust, I'll talk a little bit more about the particles. I believe that the toxins of coal it's a very similar situation that we're facing now to what smoking faced 20 or 30 years ago. I don't believe it was science that really required to tell us that it was common sense that if you breathe in smoke, which carries toxic chemicals, it's going to harm your health. It is true that not everybody gets cancer from smoking. Not everybody will get cancer or lung disease from being exposed to the toxins of coal dust, but the risk will be unnecessarily high. Coal slurry ponds are often associated with the ash, which is the byproducts of the burning at coal power plants. But there are also coal slurry ponds related to mining. And they're concerning because initially they're just some water, but over time, as more coal is washed to get it ready for market, the levels of the metals and toxins will steadily rise as the water evaporates and it becomes more concentrated. The stuff that's used to wash the coal, which is referred to as flocculant in in the Wishbone Hill mining permit, is actually a recognized carcinogenic substance that will be eventually accumulate in high concentrations in the slurry ponds. So what happens with the slurry ponds? Well, some of the water will leach into the ground, will eventually communicate with the groundwater and aquifer supplies. It's possible if the slurry ponds happen to fail, such as we live in earthquake country, that the water will contaminate things like Moose Creek and then even get into the Matanuska River. So there's a lot of concerns with this. What also happens when the water dries up is these high concentrates now are dry dust, and they become a very toxic dust. Leads me to the discussion of coal dust. Coal dust consists of very fine particles. So coal is a very light material, and the dust is a very fine particles. I'm going to try to explain this by phone, but basically take your human hair and split it to 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. Well, your body's defense mechanisms for your lungs, you have little hairs in your airway that trap bigger particles, but they can't trap these little particles. And that's why the lung experts all believe that it's these little particles that bypass the body's defense systems that are the most hazardous. They're called PM2.5s. And those PM2.5s can carry those same toxic heavy metals down deep into the lungs, where the body can then absorb them. If you examine areas surrounding coal mining or processing or storage, there is always coal dust coating everything. One of the concerns in our areas is that there's many residents in the Matanuska Valley who rely on their own gardens for food. So although some people may say, well, you breathe in a little coal dust, unless you don't have lung disease, may not be a big deal, it's the cumulative breathing it, eating it, drinking it that will stack up. Most people have heard of black lung. Black lung disease, or pneumoconiosis, is mostly associated with underground coal mining. However, there are case reports of people associated with surface coal mines, even in the administrative section, sitting in the offices nearby, coming down with black lung disease. So although your hit risk is exponentially higher if you're underground without that respirator on, there are some people that are going to be sensitive to the coal dust and could even catch it just breathing it nearby. The take-home message about coal dust is that, some take-home messages is that fugitive dust in general has been linked to asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, and heart disease. And there's little doubt that the medical literature supports that. Coal may even be more deadly because it's carrying other toxic substances that will get into your body. Back to the discussion of water, one of the things I forgot to mention with the toxic substances in the water, all those heavy metals, is that the process of coal mining actually acidifies the water. Well, when you acidify the water, it actually multiplies the release of those heavy metals, and that just makes the situation even worse. And so the water surrounding any coal processing activity oftentimes is unsafe for consumption. The next thing is, well, how do we tie all these things together? Well, there are several studies. I'm not going to say that there's this massive amount of medical science behind this like there is for pollution and smoking. You're right, it doesn't exist yet, but it's growing. Since 2007, 2008, there's been several studies that show health is degraded in communities near coal mines. The majority of those have been provided by Dr. Hendricks and his assistants at Harvard. There are some specialists. There is a consultant that states that he doesn't believe Hendricks' studies are valid. Well, I disagree, and of course, as physicians, we are with expert opinions. We can always disagree, but that expert states that Hendricks' studies do not account for smoking rates. However, I have reviewed those studies myself in detail, and they do account for smoking rates. So I believe that they are very valid. And they show a higher rate of hospital admissions, death, hypertension, high blood pressure, heart, lung diseases, and cancer in the communities that live near coal mines. There was also a study by Braben, Dr. Braben, this was many years ago, in 1994 in Great Britain, showing a directly correlated very high level of asthma in children at a school that was nearby to a coal mine. So the studies are out there. Tying them all together is a challenge, but again, to me it's common sense. We are in the same phase that we were back when everybody was debating on whether or not smoking was harmful. The next aspect of health that's impaired, or the degradation of health, is mental health. And mental health is a little bit more nebulous for some people to understand, but there's definitely a link between higher rates of mental illness and a lower socioeconomic class and a degraded environment surrounding you. Unfortunately, although coal mining does generate jobs, there's also a trend in most coal mining areas, and that, I'm not going to say every single one, but if you follow them with time, eventually it happens everywhere, that you have higher rates of poverty and unemployment. If you look at the U.S. Census closely, coal mining areas have the highest rates of poverty and unemployment in this country. Why I think that's important is because, again, mental health disorders are directly related to lower socioeconomic class, basically the stress of not having a job. Some other concerns that seem of lesser importance, but again, when you tie all these things together is what, it's not one little thing, it's all these things tied together that make the prospect of coal mining in a populated area so concerning. Is another issue is coal truck accidents. There are studies out of Kentucky that show for a rural area with not very big populations an incredibly high level of fatalities and car accidents directly related to coal trucking. Well, in those areas, coal trucks are paid by the load and the volume, basically. So their incentive is to drive as fast as they can with as heavy a load as they can. This is a risk that can be averted by easily by proper regulations. I would also like to point out that we all, as I mentioned early, and the Department of Environmental Conservation agrees with this, fugitive dust is harmful to human health. Fugitive dust leads to lung disease, we mentioned before, asthma, obstructive lung diseases such as emphysema. Well, if you take away all the trees by building giant surface mines, you are going to increase the overall fugitive dust in the Matanuska Valley. In the winter, we're all familiar in this area, for those of us who live in this area, with the Matanuska and Kinnick winds. There are numerous poor air quality days already because of the glacial silt. The communities that are most likely to be impacted by coal mining actually right now have a little bit of a tree and hill shield from that direct dust. Well, those will be stripped away. So the communities, one of the concerns of communities involved, in addition to the coal dust itself, is that when you strip the land of the trees and the other obstacles to filter out other dust, you end up with a total accumulated higher levels of dust. I'm bouncing around a little bit, but back to mental illness. There are stress-related illnesses to be concerned about as well. There's daily blasting. If you're 5-6 miles away from daily blasting, it might be hear it a little bit, but if you're a quarter mile away, that's pretty stressful every day to be sitting there worried if your windows are going to be blown in, or your foundation damaged, or your well fails. There are a lot of veterans throughout this country that have PTSD, and blasting anywhere near them, I think, is irresponsible. It just creates a constant level of anxiety for those individuals who already have another problem. So, to sum up the health effects of coal mining, again, it's not one thing. Coal is definitely toxic. That's easy information to get. You shouldn't eat it, you shouldn't drink it, and you certainly shouldn't breathe it. There are regulations for coal miners, especially underground, to wear respirators to make sure they don't breathe it. So we know coal's dangerous. We need to do a better job with research to correlate how that danger impacts local communities. But the evidence is there that coal mining is causing higher rates of illness in surrounding communities that live by. So I believe that that's kind of a summary. I'm sure some of you have come up with questions, but I think we're doing questions at the end. So that's right. Turn this over to Jessica next, or
thank you, Michelle. This is Diana. For sharing your medical expertise and your personal concern. And you're right, we're going to have time at the end of the call for questions. I also would like to point people to, if you go to healthandenvironment.org, and scroll down to our call, there is a blog set up where you could, if you're thinking of a question now, you could ask it now, and it would give us a little time to think and to incorporate it into the end if we start running short on time. So you can certainly do that. And Michelle's presentation, she was drawing from her Unhealthy Secrets of Coal presentation, which is on our website. Again, the link that I sent last Friday didn't work, but go to akaction.org for that. So thank you again, Michele. And next I'd like to introduce Jessica Winnestaffer. Jessica is the Environmental Stewardship Department Director for the Chickaloon Village Traditional Council. She has worked as a fisheries biologist for Chickaloon Village Traditional Council for 8 years, conducting salmon research, stream restoration for fish passage, salmon population enhancement, and project management. Previously, she worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, using sonar to count migrating salmon in the Yukon River and its tributaries. Jessica was raised in Sutton, Alaska, and continues to make this rural community her home. Welcome, Jessica. Would you like to begin?
Great. Thank you very much. As the introduction said, I grew up in Sutton, Alaska. I left for 4 years to earn a bachelor's degree in biology, and then I returned to live in Sutton, Alaska. I now have 1 child, and I hope to have more in the future. So I'm looking at this this condition of potential coal mining really into the long-term future and not just as an immediate impact. I began working for the Chickaloon Village Traditional Council in 2003. And just a little bit of background on the community of Sutton. Sutton is located north of Palmer in the Matanuska watershed along the Matanuska River. It is about 15 miles north of Palmer and about 60 miles northeast of Anchorage. So we are quite close to the main populace of the state of Alaska. Sutton was historically a coal mining town with relatively small coal mines along the creeks of Moose Creek, Eska Creek, and the Wishbone Hill geological formation. Coal mining also occurred in the town of Chickaloon, which is the next town up in the Matanuska watershed. Coal mining in the Sutton area and the Chickaloon area began before 1916, and by 1916 they were getting the railroad developed to the Matanuska coal field from Seward. By the 1920s, many of those mines had closed, and by 1945, all but a few mines had closed, and the railroad was no longer transporting coal after the early 1940s. Only 2 very small operations continued until the 1970s. My work at Chickaloon Village began with a multi-year project to restore fish passage on Moose Creek for salmon. And the fish passage had been impacted by those early 1920s coal mining and railroad activities. Coal mining and railroad construction, beginning in the 1916 time period, created waterfalls on the creek, which eventually blocked fish passage. By the 1970s, when the Alaska Department of Fish and Game began counting the creek's Chinook salmon population, there were salmon only in the lower 3 miles of Moose Creek. And there were only small populations of Chinook and coho salmon documented at that time. Now we have populations of Chinook, coho, and chum salmon in countable numbers, and a very few number of sockeye salmon. Previously to coal mining, there were all 5 species of Alaskan Pacific salmon in great abundance within Moose Creek, and historically the salmon of Moose Creek helped to sustain the Chickaloon tribe with numerous summer fish camps along the banks of the creek. In 2005 to 2007, Chickaloon Village reconstructed the S-turns of the pre-coal mining creek and was able to bypass the waterfalls and restore fish access to the upper Moose Creek. And now salmon are counted annually in more than 8 miles of Moose Creek. During the previous mining period on Moose Creek, the salmon had to deal with many impacts, and some of these impacts the salmon would have to deal with again in the future, and actually many more impacts as well. These impacts included habitat destruction, and when the mining actually happened in the creek, the mining actually happened in the creek bed of Moose Creek as well as along the banks of the creek. Salmon had to deal with water quality impacts. During the mining, the tailings piles, the kind of leftover material from the coal mining, was pushed into the creek, and the coal was actually washed directly into the creek. The salmon had to deal with over-harvesting by miners who used dynamite in the creek to kill the fish for their dinner. And due to many impacts, salmon populations dwindled on Moose Creek. And in addition to the fish passage restoration, Chickaloon Village has used a micro-hatchery system to restore the Chinook salmon population. For 4 years, we used a moist air incubation system that was designed by Alaska Resource and Economic Development to enhance the survival rate of Moose Creek Chinook salmon eggs. And our goal was to collect 30 pairs of salmon for the project each year. So it was a small number of salmon. We are now collecting samples of the returning adult Chinook salmon to estimate our initial project results. Many residents of the Matanuska watershed are concerned about the potential coal mines in the region. Major concerns focus around the cumulative health impacts from breathing coal dust, which Dr. Prevost just explained, as well as the surface water and groundwater contamination, which Dr. Prevost also talked about, air contamination, drying up of the underground aquifers that supply the residential wells, increased vehicle traffic with coal trucks, loss of salmon, moose, and other wildlife, loss of property values, loss of access to lands used for tribal religious and cultural ceremonies, loss of access for hunting, fishing, and recreation, and the physical harm due to stress of living near constant blasting and destruction noises. All of the Matanuska Valley coal mines that are proposed or in the planning process are located upwind of thousands of people living in and surrounding Palmer in a very, very windy valley. There are 3 coal mine areas of current concern: Wishbone Hill Coal Mine, Jonesville Coal Mine, and Chickaloon Coal Leases. Wishbone Hill Coal Mine is currently owned by Usabelli Coal Mine Incorporated and is adjacent to Moose Creek. Wishbone Hill Coal Mine is planned to be a surface strip mine, and it is located right next to a residential community. Many families live within a quarter mile of the mine site, and more than 108 families live within 1 mile of the mine site. The prevailing winds of the valley blow from the east, and they blow hard for many days of the year. The mine is directly upwind of these nearby homes and thousands more people that live just outside of a mile away. The mine plan states that a pit will be dug more than 500 feet deep to extract the coal adjacent to Moose Creek. All of the local residential wells in the area do not go this deep. Of the mine areas in the Matanuska Valley, Wishbone Hill Coal Mine is currently staged for active mining sooner than the other sites. Wishbone Hill Coal Mine has the permits necessary for exploration and some of the permits necessary for coal mining. Jonesville Coal Mine is the next coal mine site headed northeast up the valley. It is owned by Ranger Alaska, which is a subsidiary of Black Range Minerals of Australia. Jonesville Coal Mine is just a few miles east of Wishbone Hill Coal Mine, and it is planned to be a surface strip mine and an underground coal mine. Jonesville Coal Mine is adjacent to Eska Creek, which is also a salmon stream, and it's a backyard stream for many Sutton residents who live along its banks. Jonesville Coal Mine has some of its permits for exploration and mining. And just to explain how close these two mines are to residential communities without the ability to show you a map, within 2 miles of the Wishbone Hill and Jonesville coal mine areas, the taxed assessed property values are over $84 million. So there are many, many homes within the area surrounding these two coal mines. And that's just within 2 miles. Who knows if we went out as far as the 4 to 6 mile range of reaching Palmer. Chickaloon coal leases are proposed by the Alaska Mental Health Trust Land Office on more than 11,000 acres surrounding the community of Chickaloon and completely surrounding Castle Mountain. The lease areas are along the Chickaloon River and Kings River, both which historically had salmon. Kings River currently has salmon, and Chickaloon River's salmon population was wiped out in the 1920s by the initial coal mining operations there. And those populations have not ever rebounded. These mental health trust land leases have not occurred yet, and currently there are no permits for coal mining or exploration on this land. However, we anticipate the leases to happen in the very near future, like within the next couple of months. The Matanuska Valley has much more to offer to the world than coal export. We have world-class views of the Talkeetna and the Chugach mountain ranges. We have a national scenic byway, the Glen Highway. We have access to wilderness trails for hiking and biking and four-wheeling and snow machining. We have whitewater rafting and kayaking, wonderful camping opportunities. We have berry picking, hunting, and fishing. With all of the potential economic development from preserving and showcasing our spectacular area, our greater community could create many sustainable and healthy jobs that will last for decades into the future without compromising the health of the residents or the environment. There'll be opportunity for questions later, but I also want to direct you to a website for the Matt Valley coal issues, and it is the Matt Valley Coalition website, which is www.mattvalley.org. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jessica. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dennis Gann of Cook Inletkeeper. Dennis is a former commercial fisherman and tug vessel operator who worked escorting oil tankers through Prince William Sound. Prior to joining Inletkeeper in 2008, Dennis worked with the Ketchimak Bay Conservation Society, the Cook Inlet Alliance, and Cook Inletkeeper on various water quality and fisheries projects related to hard rock and coal mining. Dennis now leads Inletkeeper's efforts to organize opposition to the Chuitna coal strip mine. Please begin, Dennis.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and allowing me to have a few minutes to discuss the proposed Chuitna coal strip mine and its health and environmental impacts. For those of you who don't know, Cook Inletkeeper is a organization based out of Homer with an office here in Anchorage, and we work to protect the Cook Inlet watershed and the life it sustains. And when we heard about the proposed Chuitna coal strip mine, recognizing its impacts to salmon and clean water, we started looking deeply into it and considered it to be one of the biggest threats to the Cook Inlet watershed. I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on the project to give context to some of the concerns that the locals have. The project is proposed for It's on the west side of Cook Inlet, 45 miles west of Anchorage. It's near two small communities, Tyonek and Beluga. Tyonek is a native community of about 200 residents, and Beluga is much smaller. I think the official census says 25 people, but you probably wouldn't find that during the winter. Maybe only a dozen residents live there in the winter. However, there's some 70 to 80 residential sites there, and many folks come over during the summer and have cabins in the area. The area is off of the road system, but there is a small road system that connects the two communities. There's a company called Packrum Coal based in Delaware, financed by two Texans, who is seeking to develop Alaska's largest coal strip mine, known as the Chuitna Coal Project. Their plans include an initial pit, open pit coal mine that would cover over 5,000 acres. However, they have two additional areas that they could potentially seek to permit later on. And there are adjacent coal leases held by another company called Beluga Coal Company for a combined area of roughly 60 square miles sitting on top of the Chuitna watershed. Now, the Chuitna River is one of the few non-glaciated streams on the west side of Cook Inlet, a clear-flowing stream, relatively moderate in size compared to the much more known Kenai River on the east side of Cook Inlet. But nonetheless, all 5 species of salmon can be found in the river, but it's mostly known for its silver and Chinook runs. As I said, the coal mine, the coal pit, would cover some 5,000 acres, and current plans show that the depth of the pit would be up to 500 feet deep. This is an extremely wet area. Over 40% of the pit area is considered wetlands. And what's really unique about this project, and one of the precedents that I think all Alaskans should be concerned about, is that this project would directly mine through and remove over 11 miles of salmon streams, salmon spawning and rearing habitat. And that's never been done before in the state. We've had projects that have worked on the surface and have rerouted streams, but never to this extent where they actually remove the river, the whole river, affecting the hydrologic infrastructure of the river. That's a precedent that all Alaskans could be concerned about, and certainly the residents of Tyonek and Beluga are. Now, I can't speak for Tyonek, and in no way would suggest that I speak for them, but I have had the great opportunity to visit with them on several occasions and would like to speak to some of their concerns if they have expressed them to me. I think it's important to understand that the residents of Tyonek rely heavily on subsistence for their food sources. In fact, on a 2006 ADF&G, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, research project, they found that over 96% of the residents of Tyonek harvest wild resources, and the majority of that is wild salmon. Over 50% of the population get half of their food sources are comprised of wild salmon. And in villages like this, it's not that you harvest just for yourself, but you share them with the elders, you share them with the whole community. So there's a heavy reliance on the harvest of wild foods for their subsistence. There's no stores in Beluga or Tyonek, so that the wilderness, the area around there, is their store. It was really interesting to hear one of the elders from Tyonek. I think he put it so succinctly when he said, "I don't eat coal." They rely heavily on salmon, and so when they look at this project, they see it as basically as a breakdown between salmon and coal. There are a host of other concerns. As I mentioned, there were 5,000 acres at the coal pit area that would be ripped up, and that destabilizes the health of the entire downstream reaches of the river. But additionally, this project would affect shoreside commercial fisheries. There's 4 setnet sites, some of the most productive commercial setnet sites on the northern Cook Inlet area, that would be impacted by this project. The mine itself, the pit area, is about 12 miles from the shore. There'd be a conveyor that runs from the shore to the, from the pit to the Cook Inlet shore, and then a trestle built 2 miles out into Cook Inlet to reach deep enough water for these large Cape-class vessels. All the coal from the Chuitna coal project is destined for export market, mostly Asian coal-fired power plants. So immediately where the trestle is at the shore of Cook Inlet, there are 4 commercial set net sites. Basically, the fishermen would be fishing directly underneath the trestle. In pack rim coal documents, they measure the coal dust in tons on an annual basis. And so these commercial set net fishermen are trying to market wild Alaska salmon as one of the healthiest food sources as it is, and will be directly under this coal trestle, and so they're very concerned about the coal dust implications. And then offshore, as I mentioned, there's the 2-mile trestle into Cook Inlet. All the coal is destined for export, and so at 12 million tons export annually, the project would have basically a Cape-class vessel transporting through Cook Inlet every few days, and exporting to the Asian market would cause them to transport through Shelikof Straits. And so communities as far as Kodiak are concerned about the increased shipping traffic through the area. As Dr. Prevost mentioned earlier, mercury is one of the concerns with coal. Now, I think it's important to look back to 2007 when Governor Palin announced the first ever fish consumption advisory, and that was due to mercury being found in Alaska fish stocks. It's not found in wild Alaska salmon. It's more of the larger fish and some of the fattier fish. But nonetheless, with this coal being destined for Asian export markets, there are when that coal is burned in Asian coal-fired power plants, through oceanic and atmospheric transportation, the mercury does come back to Alaska. And while Governor Palin recognized that the mercury sources weren't here in Alaska, they were from distant sources, basically Asian coal-fired power plants. So it would be ironic in Alaska to rip up salmon streams to ship coal to Asia, only to find more mercury pollution in our other wild fish and wildlife resources. I should be very clear that the Chuitna coal strip mine would not be washing their coal, so there would be no slurry or slurry impoundments, nor are they using dynamite in their project plans. So those aren't issues here. But nonetheless, there are significant issues surrounding the Chuitna coal strip mine. There's a couple of good resources that I would suggest people look at. One would be the ChuitnaCitizens.org website, the Chuitna Citizens website, and that is at www.chuitna, which is spelled CHUITNA.org. And another website that is useful is a website sponsored by the Army Corps of Engineers, which is the lead federal agency on the environmental impact statement, and that website is www.chuitnaseis.org. And I think I'll leave it at that and allow time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dennis. And I would like to thank Michele and Jessica again as well. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And we do have about 15 minutes for discussion, which is great. I know there are a lot of people on the line. So I'm going to be opening up the line for discussion in one moment. I just wanted to point you again to the blog. Go to healthandenvironment.org, click on News and Events, then Working Group, and our call is the first one listed. So that's another way to join the discussion. So I'm now going to unmute the lines. Just one moment. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *6 on your telephone to unmute your line. and please state your name and affiliation. And since we do have so many people and we have 3 presenters, we'd appreciate it if you can be brief with your comment just to be sure that we have enough opportunity for other people. If you're not asking a question, we'd appreciate it if you would leave your line muted to reduce background noise. So again, if you want to ask a question, please press *6 to unmute. Thank you. The lines are now open.
Yeah, this is Carl Lossley with Alaska's Big Village Network. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question had to do, I didn't realize that we were so close to I knew the Mental Health Land Trust was coming into Chickaloon. So I guess my question is you know, they've done a lot of unsustainable practices in the past. I didn't quite hear how far off those lease sales are up for bid. Could I get a little bit more information about that, and how can we get involved to help protect Chickaloon from the Mental Health Trust lease sales on coal?
Great. Thanks, Carl, for that question. The Alaska Mental Health Trust Land Office anticipates having a bid opportunity within the next few months. I have not heard a specific date, but as of early summer in June, they were anticipating the next few months. So it could be any day that we hear word on that. And in terms of any strategy for trying to prevent the Mental Health Trust from leasing the lands, I'd be happy to speak with you at another point in greater detail, but really it's up to the board of directors, or the trustees as they're called, of that trust.
Thank you. Does someone else have a question? Comment?
Hello, my name is Steve Denton. I live in Healy. I'm not affiliated with any organization. I got a question for Jessica. She talked about the Moose Creek being damaged as a result of rerouting of the creek and the dumping of waste material into Moose Creek, both of which are certainly terrible things to do. But I guess the question I have is, wouldn't current regulations prohibit those activities today?
Thanks for your question, Steve. Actually, you probably know the details on current regulations better than most people. However, currently Usabelli Coal Mine Incorporated claims that it will not be dumping anything into Moose Creek, either materials or water. So I hope that that would be the case. And regarding the regulations by DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, I have questions as to how much they actually have on-site regulation eyes to pay attention to all the details.
Hi, this is Harold Shepard. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm a private consultant in Homer, and I had a question for Jessica. I understand that there is going to be a I think the state is going to conduct a health human impact assessment regarding the Windmill Hill mine, and I was wondering if you had, obviously you've probably heard about that assessment, but there's some question as to whether that is actually going to be somewhat mired in the state political process, that assessment, or if it's actually going to do some good, and if it relates to in any way to the Chickaloon's concerns about this mine.
Thanks for the question, Hal. The state is planning to conduct a health impact assessment, and Dr. Paul Anderson is heading that up within the state agencies. Chickaloon Village Traditional Council does have some concerns, as do many residential community members, as to the thoroughness of the proposed HIA, which is the Health Impact Assessment, due to the fact that the agencies would like to complete the HIA for Wishbone Hill in a matter of a couple of months. And this time frame does not allow for extensive on-the-ground research with interviewing community members, collecting baseline data on current health status of residents, collecting data on water quality and air quality conditions currently, and many other factors that can be addressed within a health impact assessment. So there are efforts to encourage Paul Anderson, Dr. Anderson, and his agencies to do a more thorough and more time-costly evaluation of the Wishbone Hill coal mine. And so if anybody is interested in encouraging a more thorough evaluation, Dr. Paul Anderson would be the person to contact. Thank you, Hal.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments for any of our speakers?
No.
Michelle, Jessica, Dennis?
Hi, Diana. This is Pam Miller, Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and I had a question for Dr. Prevost concerning the EPA study that you referenced, Michelle, and I was curious to hear a little bit more about that. That was related to coal slurry and increased cancer risk. It would be great to hear a little bit more about that. And secondly, I was wondering, you talked a lot about respiratory effects and some other health effects associated with exposure to coal dust and other mining-related activities. I was curious to know if in your research of the literature, if you've come across any literature concerning reproductive health effects. I know recently there was a study looking at increased rates of birth defects. This was around mountaintop removal, which is, of course, a different type of coal mining, but I wondered if you came across any research concerning reproductive health effects. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me see if I can remember all the questions. The EPA study was actually kind of a preliminary report that was released, and it was based on levels of arsenic in the surrounding groundwater, and didn't define in their study necessarily if you were a quarter mile away or a mile away, and of course that will vary on the geology as well as to how far the arsenic spread. But the numbers of arsenic, the concentrations of arsenic in the water created cancer risks attributed to be up to 10,000 times normal baseline risk. That was kind of a preliminary report, and I don't believe they've actually fully released the whole report yet. I just, somewhere in my files, have some notes from the preliminary report. As far as the reproductive, the only thing I've really come across is basically related to the mercury, in that it causes birth defects, and it's certainly possible that since it affects the nervous system, it actually causes difficulties with just reproduction in general. If you come across something that was more specific, then I would appreciate that information, because I did not come across that myself.
Thank you.
I've been trying to prepare something. Good morning. This is Violet Yetton. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good morning. I'm calling from Port Graham. I'm here in the native village of Port Graham. We're just on across the inlet from from Tyonek, and obviously all the coastal communities in the Cook Inlet will be impacted by this Chuitna, by this proposed mine. My question, I don't know who to pose this question to. We've been involved with the oil and gas as far as being very vocal in opposition to what's happening with the oil and gas here in the Cook Inlet, and any in protecting our subsistence and our water, also our air. What would you advise, or who would, if you have some advice for the folks on the phone, what do you recommend are some next steps? Because, we'll continue to be vocal and support the other communities. In my eyes, it's the community of Tyonek being directly impacted by this mine and their ability to continue their traditional way of life. And so I would just like to know what are some recommended next steps, and what do you see as far as the tribes and the other communities being involved in this process. Thank you.
This is Dennis, and I'd like to try to answer a bit of that. Thank you for the question, and I'd also like to share with folks that the native village of Tyonek has done some informal polling in their community, and 10% of the community is opposed to the mine. And within the last year, the native village of Tyonek signed a resolution of formal opposition to the mine and have shared that with various agencies and I believe in the governor. But I think those sorts of things are really important for concerned citizens and communities to do, is to go formally on the record opposed to these sorts of projects, and make sure that the regulatory agencies and the governor understand your concerns and your opposition to these projects. There will be time for official comments during the EIS process, but I don't think that it's necessary to wait for, especially tribal governments, to wait for that, and it's important for them to let their opposition be known.
This is Jessica Winnestaffer. I wanted to add to what Dennis just said. Violet, thank you for your question, and definitely the more coalition building we can do, the stronger the opposition would be to the Chuitna mine or any mine. One area that the native village of Port Graham might want to consider voicing their opinion, in addition to the tribal resolution, which Dennis suggests, is the health impact assessment for the Chuitna mine. And from my basic understanding of that process, only a few communities were going to be considered directly impacted by the Chuitna mine. And so I think it might be an opportunity for Port Graham to let both the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the state agencies know that they feel that they will be very much impacted by the Chuitna mine.
We are just about, we are pretty much out of time, so I should probably make our closing comments here, but I would also like to say if you have additional questions or comments, you can feel free to contact Alaska Community Action on Toxics at 907-222-7714 or by email at sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at akaction.org. And in addition, several websites are listed on the call resource page, different groups that are working on these issues. So please use those resources. The recording of today's call will be available on our website within a few days. And also our next teleconference will be on Wednesday, August 24th, and is titled Toxic Chemicals That Disrupt Hormones, Impacts on Fish and People. So mark your calendars for that. And again, I would just like to thank everyone who called in and our presenters for having this discussion today. Thank you very much.